Well, my name is Elaine Wang. I'm currently the city manager for the city of Winooski. I've been in Vermont for 19 years. And I think it's interesting how generally people of color, like we tell you how long we've been in Vermont because everyone wants to know, right? Like if you're white, you don't necessarily have to say. And part of me saying that is like, I've been here a little bit, not forever and not multi-generationally, but I have been here for a bit. So it changes the dynamic of the conversation sometimes. I can't, of course, know how it would have gone if I hadn't said that, but it seems to make a difference. Like people say, oh, right. And they take what I say maybe a little differently. So I have been in Vermont for 19 years. And when I got here, I'm 45 now. When I got here, I was 25. And I grew up in California where there was a lot of people of color, a lot of Asians, a lot of different kinds of Asians. I'm Chinese American. I had a whole big Chinese American community, right? Like not just Chinese, like immigrated here, but born here. So I was born in the US. And I didn't have the type of race consciousness that I have now. Some of it is probably age, and some of it is because I've been in a very white state for the last 19 years. And when your minoritized identity is visible, it becomes a very important part of your identity. And so that's been true for me. And in some ways, of course, it's like a double-edged sword. I appreciate it. I love the cultural heritage that I get to have. And my parents are quite Chinese, especially my mom. Like Chinese culture is just one of her passions. So she likes to be able to pass that on to my sister and me. So I appreciate having that. And also, we all, like Susanna Davis said it perfectly. Like she just wants to be politely ignored like everyone else. So certainly sometimes I want that too. And in Vermont, when we first got here, we used to travel around the state a lot. My husband, who's white, he jokes that I'm a Chinese redneck because I have some of I eat roadkill, I hunt, I like being in the woods. These are some of the things that he and I have in common, and he identifies as a redneck himself. So, so we're like doing all these things. I don't feel like it's anything weird that I'm doing because I grew up doing that. My parents took us camping and stuff. I didn't hunt growing up, but I spent some time in Alaska, so I got used to that idea there. And, so we go into these diners, and after a while, I train myself not to look at anyone when I walk in because everyone in the diner will stop and stare at me when I walk in, which, who wants to be stared at like you're a giraffe? That's the feeling it is. Like, you don't know what to do with me, right? It's like, what? And it isn't even necessarily like hostility, right? It's just like, what? And they'll just stare because they don't recognize me as human. Because if they did, they would know that would feel awkward for them and they would stop staring, but they don't make that connection. So that's why I stopped looking at anyone when I walked into a diner. And recently I've decided I'm not going to avert my gaze anymore. If you're going to stare at me, I'm going to stare at you until you realize how awkward that is. And then you stop staring at me. So that's one thing that's happened to me after living here for 19 years. But the other thing that is part of my Vermont experience is that, this is kind of a small pond in terms of like, there's just not enough people for all the work that we all want to do. And so there's not, a ton of competition. It's not that hard to be a big fish in this little pond. So I've also had a lot of opportunity to try things that I probably would have had to compete with a lot more people if I had wanted to do it somewhere else. I came here on a whim, basically. And Vermont in that way has been very good to me, right? So, in some ways as a woman or a female presenting person, I'm non-binary, but as a female presenting person, as an Asian, I'm probably had to work harder to prove myself. And in fact, there's definitely times when I know I was working harder to prove myself, but I did have the opportunity. And the fact that I'm a city manager in Vermont when I didn't have that background, it's unusual. And actually nationally, there's very few city managers who are Asian or chief administrators of municipalities that are Asian. And I know that because I'm a member of the International Network of Asian Public Administrators, which is affiliated with the trade profession so we have a better idea than anyone about how many there are that are like us. And there's just not that many. So being able to do in Vermont when I didn't have that background to begin with, again, there's not so many people, so I can try all these things, right? I was invited to the UVM Mosaic Center's one of their annual events a few years ago, and they had found me because they wanted to hear from an alumni who had decided to stay. So the Mosaic Center, for those of you who don't know, is what UVM provides as a resource center for students of color. And part of my talk there was, you can do whatever you want in Vermont because there's less barriers to you doing it. Now, as an Asian person, you know, there's some barriers that I don't face, and I'm able-bodied. Some things that give me privilege. So I'm not saying it's easy, but in terms of like competition, in some ways it can be easier. So there's things that I've been able to do here that would have been harder, I think, in another state. So I've appreciated that part of my Vermont experience. And, you know, this is a reminder for those of us with a marginalized identity. You know, sometimes, you know, one of the reasons why I wanted to be the manager for Winooski is because there's a mandate here for at least racial equity and certainly acknowledgement of several other equities as well, especially like LGBTQIA+. And, you know, we are working on disability access. So that mandate is there. And also sometimes just existing and doing what you want to do is resistance. And the beauty of it is it's also joy, right? So there's this trend among people of color, for example, that talk about like joy is liberation and part of the movement. So I'm glad that I have that space to do that here. I can be in the woods, and that's actually changing the world, because someone who comes across me in the woods, like I organized this event at my last job, which was also for a local government in central Vermont. And there was a resident who was talking to me and was, you know, nice guy, had a great conversation. And at some point he mentioned that he had never had a conversation with an Asian before. So just existing in that space is like an act of education. That's the weird thing that we're all doing as people of color, as Asians in Vermont. If I had, like, there's no simple way to evaluate what that is, right? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it complicated? Is it a gift? Is it a curse? It's all those things. So how has my heritage shaped me? So I'm Chinese American again. I was born in the United States. My parents came from China. And my mom made sure I had a grounding in Chinese language. And so, but I basically had a child's vocabulary, but not much of an accent. So that was pretty good for, you know, ABCs, as they're called, American born Chinese. I then got a job while I was in Vermont, of all places, for an international organization, which for 5 years sent me to China quite a bit. And so when I was there, I developed an adult's vocabulary, and I got to the point where I was fluent within my field. But with that grounding, I wanted to try and keep it up, and I didn't do much about it until something that my niece said gave me the idea of taking Confucian lessons with my mom. So once a week we have a FaceTime call, and she goes over, she found this website that does explainers, because Confucius is incredibly pithy. It's like 5 words or 10 words, and it's this whole page of things that have to go with that. There's a cultural element, there's a historical element, there's what do the words mean, because it's kind of ancient Chinese, so all these things. So it's an opportunity for me to practice reading Chinese and then get kind of more grounded into the culture. This profound moment I had about that. So, you know, as an American-born Chinese who's surrounded by white people and doesn't get to use my language very often as a link back to my cultural roots, as someone who's not around a lot of Chinese people, sometimes I've felt like unmoored, right? So am I losing my Chineseness? This is kind of a common lament, right, that children of immigrants have. So we're going through the Confucian Analects, which is what his texts are called. And there was a moment when I was like, you know, this all seems very natural to me, right? Like some of it is sexist. Let's just put that out there. And some of it is very much of the time, but a lot of it is still relevant today. A lot of it is, this is how to be a person, a good person. And especially people who are like of my parents' generation and older, this is their education. That's one of the texts that they memorize of several. And it's shaped Chinese society for millennia. And I said, you know, some of these things seem very matter of course, and you live that way, but I don't remember you and Dad ever talking about it. My mom said, well, yeah, it's not something you talk about. You just do it. And I realized that it was something I had absorbed so deeply, that Confucianism, like the precepts of how to be a good person, I had absorbed. It was like in my bones, in my blood, in my tissues from my parents living that way. And it gave me this moment of like, I can't lose that, you know, it's not possible for me to lose that. And how wonderful to just always have that tie back to my cultural heritage. And I'm going to, on the screen here shortly, you'll see some calligraphy that I asked my mom to do when I started this job as a city manager of Winooski. I asked her to come up with a phrase that meant persistence. So in my mind at the time, it was the equity work that we're trying to do here. It takes persistence, right? A lot of us are trying to figure out how to do it. I don't need to convince anyone here why, but how is still, you know, it's the question. And so, you know, what the lesson I learned about doing equity work in a municipality is like, don't, you know, keep the train moving, meaning like, don't give up. You're going to mess up, but if you stop because you mess up or you're afraid of messing up, you're not going to, of course, you're not going to succeed. You're not going to get there. So just keep the train moving. So I asked her to come up with something that meant persistence and to write that. And she chose actually a phrase out of the Confucian Analects, which mean that. So from right to left, it reads 任重道远. That's how traditional Chinese text is read, right to left. And that means the purpose is weighty and the way is long, meaning that, you know, you can grammatically work with that in a few ways, but things that are worth doing take a while. The things that you're doing are worthwhile if they're taking a while. What you're working on is worth it. Like all those things are kind of wrapped up in that phrase. So it's so wonderful to me to like be able to display that in my workplace and have people ask about it and be curious about it. And I have this chance to share this piece of myself with them, and to have my mom's calligraphy with me and have my cultural heritage with me in the office. It's a gift.